Hello, welcome to Judic. I am outside the Celtic Music Interpretive Center, which you might know because Burt Feintuch writes about it in part in today's article, Music at the Margins. Burt Feintuch, as he mentions a little bit in the article himself, he started, his first position was at Western Kentucky, and then for the bulk of his career, he was in New Hampshire, University of New Hampshire Research Center there. His area was basically fiddle, English fiddle. He did stuff in Kentucky. I think his undergraduate work was on black choral music, I believe. I need to look that up. But he did significant work in Cape Breton. There is Burt passed away in 2018, and there was he was significant loss, and he is here. He was a contributor to the Celtic Music Interpretive Center, and there was a fundraising concert. I've got some footage. The next year, sort of memorial concert for him, and donations were asked. When he died, he asked for donations to be made to here. So he's a tight with the community. He produced 2 albums for the Smithsonian Institute on Cape Breton fiddle music, yes, remarkable, nice guy, and truly missed. But today's article was written as a keynote address. If you're the kind of person who reads the endnotes, you know this already, for NAFCO, which is the North American Fiddle Convention. So you might recognize that there's a certain assumptions that are being made about the audience, which is completely fair. They obviously have an affinity and a more than passing understanding of fiddle music and the contemporary fiddle music scene, and sort of the pan-Celticism that sometimes implies. He read little asides where he says, as everyone here probably knows, Natalie McMaster, da 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 da. So there's some interesting points in this article. For one thing, he unabashedly loved Cape Breton. It was sort of part of his DNA, and he waxes eloquently about that. And sometimes it gets a little bit florid, but that's maybe just my own aesthetics. But I think he locates that in part because, for one thing, he genuinely feels it, and at the same time, he wants to sort of begin the argument of reconciling how someone can have an affinity for a place and affinity for the musical culture of a place that is nevertheless asking difficult questions, and questions that as an outsider might be seen as impertinent. That's probably a fair way of talking about it. And he's using margins in sort of 3 senses. He never comes outright and says it, but there's 3 specific marginal aspects that are happening here. One is Cape Breton itself as a margin, and you can make an argument in Inverness County as a marginal part of Cape Breton. Not unimportant. That isn't what he's talking about, but he's talking about something that is different from the center. He's talking about something that is at the periphery. So not marginal in terms of insignificant, marginal in terms of removed from certain benefits of power. And Cape Breton, part of Cape Breton's identity is this removed status, this distance from, well, again, Cape Breton County has a distance from, Cape Breton Island outside of industrial Cape Breton sees themselves as marginal to industrial Cape Breton to the mainland, and subsequently to other centers of economic power on generic mainland, Halifax specifically, Toronto, generic Canada, and prior to that, the United Kingdom, when certainly when coal and steel were owned by English as opposed to mainland Canadian conglomerates. There's this sort of sense of being on the periphery. The second is about traditional music itself, that it is it's a niche within the contemporary music sphere. When he was writing this in 2001, you were just getting at the tail end of the kind of Celtic revival, pop Celticism, world music phenomenon that happened in the 1990s, which was when you saw so much investment and reinvestment and the very points that he's making subsequently in the article, the sort of boom that happened in Cape Breton Celtic music was in part of this larger sort of global phenomenon of world music. But still, it's different from, and markedly and marketedly, puns, different from pop music, although it finds itself competing with pop music. And then third is the marginal status of the musician, him or herself. This idea of the musician that is, the musician is a cultural character, a stock character in vernacular culture, of someone who might have particular gifts and might be required for the proper exercise of communitas, and yet nevertheless, because they have devoted themselves to that craft, are not necessarily contributing characters in the ergic work responsibilities of the community. So like the lazy musician, the alcoholic musician, and so on. He's not suggesting that the people he's talking about are there, but he is talking about how musicianship is already a kind of questionable role to play because you should be working, and it's the basic argument of the arts and the purpose of arts to begin with, in terms of proper respect should be paid towards these industries, and you are fiddling. Well, as we know, and ironically what happens, and ironically throughout the article, one of the things that he talks about is that cultural forms like music are now economic forms. That coal is gone, steel is gone, fishing is depleted. People don't make nearly as much money off of the forestry in Cape Breton, little money off of agriculture or horticulture, but the industry, as the industry in Cape Breton is fundamentally the cultural industry that is cannot be disentwined from tourism. So that becomes the irony, in that what was once a beloved peripheral character is now in some ways integrated into the very economic lifeblood and survival of the island, which is an ironic position at the very least. So but it's always been difficult to be a full-time musician anywhere, and it's doubly difficult to be a full-time musician in Cape Breton, especially when the employment situation is contingent to begin with. That employment, I don't know if you know this, but employment is sometimes hard to come by in Cape Breton. So you have for years, for at least 50 years, probably longer. I mean, there are narratives that date back to the late 19th century that talk about it, at least on a seasonal basis, people having to go away to work. And the idea now that people fundamentally would be moving away. So in order to be a musician, either you move to Halifax, or you move to the or you find some kind of work maybe related to music, but just as often not in a place where work is already hard to come by. And so to stay on island requires this sort of remarkably flexible set of skills. That said, in the context, here I'm quoting from page 112, in the context of Cape Breton, it seems as if more than chance is at work, and it's provocative to think about the local conditions that contribute to this flourishing local world of old music. Given that Cape Breton fiddle music is thriving when many other Western regional musics of the same vintage have largely vanished or radically transformed themselves, what might account for this vitality of this music in a place that is, in many regards, on the margins? So he's asking the academic question, why here? How is it happening? How are you able to sustain it? And one of the things that he does talk about is the story that Cape Breton tells itself about its music. And again, it has to do with that precise idea of marginalization. Isolation, literally in the sense of isola, the Latin form for island. By being on an island, removed from Scotland. You know, that you have this population that arrived, bringing the music with them, and then were fundamentally cut off. So that the music that stayed here incubated in this almost ideal situation that wasn't influenced by a proximity to other musical traditions. That is the narrative, at the very least, that it is purer here. And every now and then, that sense, that narrative becomes not substantiated, but someone external gives it validation. And so you will have Scottish music people who will talk about how, well, the old style of music is probably most like the music that is currently being played in Cape Breton. And the Cape Bretoners go like, oh, thank you very much. So this idea that it is unsullied, this sort of folk revival, this folk society model, that it is hasn't been subjected to the vicissitudes of modernity in the same way that Scottish music in Scotland has, is very much part of the identity. He challenges that idea. He says it's not, it's historically wonky, and that there are other styles that are present in it, that it has been influenced by Acadian fiddle, it has been influenced by heaven forfend English music, it has been influenced by Irish and even Mi'kmaq music traditions. But that being said, there is this remarkable resilience. One of the interesting points of resiliency, as it were, is a sort of a faithfulness and a fealty to text, where in the 19th century songbooks that had been published in Scotland were available and for sale in Cape Breton, and then people would defer to the text. And so this sort of purity that is, in theory, sustained through the fiddle itself, like somehow sustained through the pure spirit of the folk, but it's only in so much as the pure spirit of the folk defers to this textual tradition. So let's go back to here. And there's always, I mean, that is as blanket a statement as anything else. And you know, the truth lies somewhere ambiguously in the middle. I'm in the middle of tourist season. This is cool. So, but anyway, yeah, the story the Cape Bretoners tell about their music. From Scottish emigrants, and thanks to geographic isolation, changed less than in Scotland, the music represents a purer and older Scottish style and repertoire, and the music played than the music that is currently played in Scotland. But it is now, the music becomes representative of the Gaelic tradition, in large part, especially when language has been reduced so much. One of the things that's always interesting to see is when we're talking about immigrant communities that are also defined by their language, and that language tends to disappear because the first generation, not always the first generation, but either through active oppression or through through desire to acclimate to the language of the dominant majority culture, language tends to disappear. And so it is through these other forms that do not necessarily require linguistic abilities. So in, like, among Ukrainian Canadians, for example, food is important, embroidery, dance, music, but not necessarily Ukrainian fluency. Similarly, in Cape Breton, you had music long after Gaelic started to ebb. Now, we do have a Gaelic language revival that is quite strong, and who knows what's going to happen with that. But that is the thing that is, in a way, more on its crutches than the Celtic music and fiddle music in particular. He points to the fact that the naming of this highway, Highway 19, is the Cayley Trail, and the highway sign has the fiddle on it. And the sign in Mabu, which is just up the road, has a fiddle on it. The fiddle is emblematic of Cape Breton Celtic identity, and that is a thing. It is indicative of something, and he's poking around about what these things, what it might be indicative of. But one of the things that's interesting is the biographies that people tell, and again, I just pointed out the story that people tell about Cape Breton music, and then the subcategory of that is the life histories that Cape Breton musicians tell about their own indoctrination into music. I might seem to be pointing out or nitpicking about Cape Breton particularly. It just happens to be this is the particular instance that we're speaking about. And life histories of musicians are really fascinating because they are performances. They are markers of identity. Barry Lee Pearson talks about it in his Seems So Good to Me, which is about how bluesmen frame their stories in a particular way. Cape Breton musicians tend to talk about the ubiquity of music. Oh, music was everywhere. Music was the dances, and so on. With the picnics, with church affiliation, that music was everywhere, and it becomes this idea of music is inherently part of the social capital. The fundamentally that often in the absence of actual sort of economic capital, and I shouldn't say the word actual, but I mean capital is a metaphor. And so in the absence of the thing that we typically think of as capital, exchangeable goods, we have social capital. It's something that is valued, that the value is the sociability of place. It's a thick social capital aspect. And this is when he starts to speak harshly, in that Cape Breton is fundamentally in a period of a long, slow economic decline, maybe through various ebbs and flows. Maybe we're currently in an upswing, maybe we're not, but the narrative of Cape Breton is often and buoyed by the economic actual sort of data of Cape Breton, has to do with issues of decline, and more importantly, population decline that is a consequence of economic uncertainty. So you have this idea that integral to the Cape Breton narrative is the sense that one is going to have to leave someday. Or if you're not leaving, your children are probably leaving, and because the economics can't sustain it. So then, ironically, what you have is this duplex of tourism, because not only do you have Cape Breton as a cultural center that becomes, there's landscape, but there's also culture, and it becomes sort of fetishized in a way. Like, come to this place, this island that has this interesting blend of traditional things where people still live or people still commune according to social capital rules as opposed to capitalist rules, where people still participate in these performances and these artistic achievements, and that's part of the tourism market. You also have diaspora tourism. You have out migrant tourism, where people come home every summer, and with the perhaps sort of laying the groundwork for the expectation of returning to retire, which may or may not ever happen, because the next generation has created families and careers that are even less Cape Breton rooted. They are only rooted narratively, as opposed to sort of pure sort of biographically. But these two forms of tourism become the economic resource, and then music sort of ties into that. So now you have the irony. If you already talked about musician as a marginal character, you have people who, inspired by some of the genuine musical success of Natalie McMaster, of Ashley McIsaac, and the Rankins and the Cotters and a couple of other characters like that. You have people who are trying to make it as full-time musicians who aren't doing the day job, which is the rarity. It is the exception. It is you can make a sort of a parallel to people. He does make the parallel to sort of hockey moms or hockey parents, and the idea that the chances of getting into the NHL are minute. But people are nevertheless pursuing from a young age this sort of aspiration of using sport as a way out, or at least as a form of security. You have things like, obviously, different from popular musician. You have things like being able to pay for university education, for example. So it diverges a little bit, but for the most part, you have this sort of vain hope of achieving the almost inachievable. But with musicianship, they're not necessarily developing the flexible skill set that historically the musicians either always had or didn't have, and then were conspicuous for not having, and reaffirmed their marginal status. So, what he leaves you with, and what he's leaving his audience with, this audience at the NAFCO, the North American Fiddle Convention, is still this question about the remarkable resilience, that it can't simply be a matter of markets, that there has to be something about the persistence of this musical tradition where, in situations that are similar, economic uncertainties, marginal status in terms of being away from the centers of economic power and economic growth as industries change, and yet music retains this. It can't simply be a matter of tourism, or tourism can't be the only engine for it. And there has to be something about the value, the social capital, the value that is placed on musicianship as a form of identity for place. So he leaves it as a question, and it's a sort of an open point. There's a great video that I'm going to link to probably through this video somehow. Historically, I see people pointing to corners, so I'll pop it in a corner there, where he gives a talk from a few years later at the Library of Congress. And he takes a lot of this article, and he also ties it into his subsequent work, which is with paraders in New Orleans. Again, an intensely regional musical culture that clearly is tied up with tourism, but tourism doesn't explain it in its entirety. So, that was Burt Feintuch's Music at the Margins.